Despite widespread knowledge about the dangers of asbestos, many in the industry fail to adhere to the control of asbestos regulations. For example, a recent survey found that up to 1/5 of those managing maintenance staff did not ensure that asbestos surveys were in place, and in 2010-11, the HSE decided to prosecute in more than 30 cases. The newly released 2012 Control of Asbestos Regulations now supersedes the 2006 version. The updated regulations set out a need for more detailed and extensive documentation, but the most significant change is the introduction of a new tier of work called notifiable non-licensed work.
Well, to talk us through the changes to the control of asbestos regulations, I'm delighted to welcome Gillian Birkby from Fladgate. Hello, Gillian. Thanks for coming in. Can we start, please, with the onus of the updated regulations is still on the duty holder. Could you remind us what a duty holder actually is?
A duty holder is somebody who has a responsibility for the maintenance or the repair of non-domestic premises.
Okay, and could in theory an architect be a duty holder?
Yes, they could. Because if they're doing a project and that involves some kind of maintenance or some repair works, refurbishment, that kind of thing, then they will be a duty holder, but with others, they won't be the only one.
So have the type of premises covered by the regulations changed at all?
No, there are still non-domestic premises and ones which were constructed prior to the year 2000, because that was the year in which asbestos was banned.
We'll come to the specific changes of the updated regs in a moment, but in general, has the way in which asbestos is to be treated, has that changed as well?
No, what happens is that either you can leave it as it is, if it's in good condition, or you can encapsulate it, or in certain circumstances, of course, you will be needing to deal with it, to treat it in some way, and then you need to have a way of managing that process.
Okay, and this is the duty to manage thing. So can you explain what is meant by duty to manage?
What you need to do is you need to have a suitable and a sufficient assessment. Those are the words the HSE use. And it's got to be suitable and sufficient to avoid anybody being exposed to asbestos fibres, to inhaling asbestos fibres.
And the key to this is the kind of documents you keep on site. Can you run through the documents that you'll be required to keep?
While you're on site, the best thing to do is to have the asbestos register. This is the document which puts the assessment, sets it out in writing. So you'd have that document. You would also have possibly an asbestos plan. That is, if the person who controls the building has got permits to work, things like that, then you would have those. You would then, if you were starting work, before you did that, you'd do a demolition or a maintenance survey just to make sure you're absolutely sure where all this asbestos is. And then finally, you'd have something, a work plan, a method statement, which would set out exactly how you're going to do the work.
As with the superseded 2006 regulations, an understanding of the difference between licensed and non-licensed work remains key. Licensed work is that undertaken on asbestos-based material that is friable and which will release significant numbers of fibres when worked on. Examples of such material includes brown asbestos insulation board, asbestos lagging, and sprayed asbestos. Non-licensed work refers to materials where the asbestos fibres are locked in a stable condition. Typically, such materials include corrugated asbestos roofing, cement roofing, and gaskets.
In both the 2006 and now the 2012 regulations, it's all about notifying the HSE. In relation to licensed work, what does notifying mean?
Notifying for licensed work means that you tell the HSE in writing where you're going to do the asbestos works, how many people are going to be involved with it, what measures you're going to take to deal with it, to protect the workforce, exactly what sort of asbestos it is, that kind of thing. And then the crucial thing is that you have to give 14 days notice of that, so that you can see straight away that if you haven't got yourself organised about your asbestos before you start on site, you could be looking at up to 2 weeks of delay to the whole of the project. And obviously nobody's going to be very happy about that. So that's another reason why you should try and get your asbestos organised before the works start on site.
And last point that relates to both the 2006 and the 2012, there's a need for to supply suitable training. What does that mean?
It's suitable depending on who's doing the work. If it's a licensed contractor and it's one of their workforce, then obviously they will need quite a lot of training on how to do it and how to do it safely. If it's somebody else, maybe part of the consultant team, maybe another contractor who occasionally does work involving asbestos, they will need training as well to understand what asbestos looks like. Passing it around in a glass bottle is what they usually do. So it's what it looks like, and also the sort of measures that you should take if you find it, how to deal with it, and also obviously a thorough understanding of why it's a serious problem.
From April 2012, some non-licensed work where the risk of fibre release is greater became subject to 3 additional requirements: notification, the need for medical examination of workers, and additional record keeping. This work is now known as notifiable non-licensed work, or NNLW.
Gillian, so notifiable non-licensed work, or NNLW, in a nutshell, this is non-licensed material, quote, where the risk of fibre release is greater.
Right. What you've got to remember, first of all, is, as we said earlier, you've got your licensed work and your non-licensed work. So the licensed work stays exactly as it is. The non-licensed work is now in 2 separate categories, both the sort that's notifiable and the sort that isn't. And so the sort that's notifiable, the NNLW, is work where there is liable to be some fibre release in the work that you carry out. And so, for instance, if you're dealing with, say, Artex ceiling decoration, and you're removing that, then you might be creating an asbestos slurry, or you might be doing something which would cause that to release some fibres. Not
so this
many.
Is drilling, anything like that?
Yeah. If you're doing drilling, or if you're repairing lagging, or if you're taking up floor tiles that contain asbestos, that sort of work.
Okay. And drilling one single hole?
Yeah, actually, drilling one hole could still release fibres, because if you take asbestos insulation board, actually the HSE has done this great task sheet which actually explains how to do it. And if you look at the front page of that, you see that the man there who's showing you what he's doing, drilling a hole, is wearing really serious amounts of PPE. So it's not, you can release a lot of asbestos, or sufficiently significant amounts of asbestos fibres, just from drilling one hole. Obviously, you hope not to, but there are circumstances when that can happen.
So looking at that picture, Gillian, that the PPE that guy's wearing, it's overstating what's needed to drill a single hole.
You don't know if the release of the asbestos fibres from the person drilling through the AIB is actually going to be the thing that causes him to develop asbestosis later in life. You can't say that. It might be. And you don't know either if he's a smoker, because if you're a smoker, it's much more likely that you're going to suffer from asbestosis. So we don't say, right, only non-smokers can work on building sites and work with asbestos. We don't do that. So, what we do say is that they must protect themselves as far as can be done against asbestos.
So the HSE sets a control limit for asbestos as 0.1 asbestos fibres per cubic centimetre of air. Is the project team really expected to go around measuring the amount of asbestos in each part of the site? That's not going to happen, is it?
No, it isn't going to happen. I think you've got to sort of apply a certain amount of common sense to this one. If you start getting anxious about the amount of dust in the air, then really you should be treating that as something that's notifiable, and you should be making sure that everyone's got the right sort of PPE on. So no, you shouldn't be thinking about, should I be measuring? If you're thinking about measuring, then maybe you should even be thinking about licensed work rather than non-licensed work.
So let's say your scheme involves the removal of Artex. How do you decide the status of the work under the new regulations? Well, the HSE has produced a flowchart to help. The condition of the material being removed, i.e. whether it is in a poor or a good condition, is first determined. The condition of the material dictates whether the work is non-licensed or notifiable non-licensed work.
We heard just there about material being in either poor or good condition, but are there any legal precedents that actually help people understand that in black and white?
There aren't any legal precedents that are going to be particularly helpful to you, because a lot of the cases are where somebody has been really bad in the way that they've treated asbestos. They've ignored it. They've allowed their workforce to be exposed to very large quantities of it and so on. And that isn't what we're talking about with non-licensed work, notifiable. So really it's a matter of exercising your professional judgment. But you know, people in construction do that all the time, so it's nothing new. It's just something else that you need to do that.
So in practical terms, on site, what would the duty holder actually have to do?
What you would do is, first of all, you'd have your risk assessment and you may take the asbestos register for that, but you'd have a certain task that you were doing, say you're drilling your hole in your asbestos board. And what you would do then is, you would do a risk assessment and then produce a method statement exactly how you're going to do it. Now, this is where what the HSE has done is produce a whole raft of task sheets, and they set out in just 2 pages usually.
These are the task sheets you mentioned earlier, I take it.
That's right.
Okay.
And what they actually say on them is that if you're doing exactly the kind of work covered by that task sheet, you can use that as your risk assessment. And then if you read on, you'll see that it's a method statement as well. So it's really worth looking at that on the website, HSE's website, to find that.
Okay. I'm going to read you a quote here. It says, the new regs require that all workers undertaking, quote, notifiable non-licensed work with asbestos must be under health surveillance by a doctor. Health surveillance sounds like a nightmare. How will that work in practice?
Yeah, I think HSE realises that it could be perceived as something of a nightmare. What they said is, first of all, it doesn't come into force until the 30th of April 2015, so we've all got time to organise ourselves. Secondly, the health surveillance is once every 3 years. So by that date, everybody who is working with asbestos, which are involved in or coming into contact with asbestos, which could be consultants as well, must have had this medical, and obviously it's a medical looking at your respiratory tract and so on. So they must have had that medical, and then anybody coming new into the industry, say guy coming in as an apprentice or whatever, they must have one when they start work. And then every 3 years that is repeated until they either cease doing that kind of work or they leave the company that they're working for. And this, the way in which you track whether which members of your workforce are due for their 3-year renewal, the suggestion is that because you've got a notice, a record of this NNLW, because you've submitted it to the HSE, that you just write on there which of your workers were actually involved in that particular project. Consultants will have to have a slightly different system, but I think we've got enough time for April 2015 to work out something fairly simple.
And if you don't, and you get it all wrong, what punishments and fines can be levied for failing to comply with the new regulation?
Well, that's an interesting question, because although it's NNLW and therefore it's not mega asbestos in the way that you would if it was licensed work, if you actually breach the regulations, you are very likely also to be breaching the Health and Safety at Work Act, which says that you must provide a safe system of work for your employees, and that you must avoid exposing members of the public to risks to their health and safety. And I can't see a situation where you're in breach of the NLW section of the regs and you aren't also in breach of that obligation to provide the safe system of work, etc., for which the fine is unlimited. But the fine that a judge might impose is a complicated calculation, and it's based partly on basically how bad you have been in ignoring your duties. So if you've tried hard to comply and you've tried hard to follow the regulations, but maybe you've fallen down in some way, then you will be treated more lightly than if you've just ignored everything and asbestos has gone everywhere.
Okay, super stuff. Any last thoughts or final pointers before we go?
What you need to bear in mind is that even if there is no sign of any personal injury, the HSE can still prosecute for breach of the regulations, and they will do that. They will be successful in that because they don't need to prove that anybody has actually inhaled the fibres and is going to develop asbestosis. I think the other thing is just to remember that you need to refresh your training of your staff regularly. So don't think when you've done it once, that's it, you never need to do it again. Just think about that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. For more information on dealing with asbestos, do look at the HSE website and, of course, MBS TV's Managing Asbestos programme. Gillian, thanks ever so much for coming and talking to us. Thank you very much. And until next time, goodbye.